Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going to be exploring behaviorism.
Okay.
You might remember it from Psych 101, but trust me, it's way more interesting than those dry textbook definitions. You've sent us some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy, and we're going to break down how behaviorism tries to explain, well, behavior.
That's right. Behaviorism really wants to take the mystery out of the mind. It argues that instead of getting lost in speculation about what's going on in our heads, we should focus on what we can actually observe. Our actions.
Okay, that makes sense. But the Stanford Encyclopedia mentions that the word behaviorism gets thrown around a lot. Is there one clear definition?
It's a little tricky. Sometimes behaviorism refers to a general attitude like, hey, if we can't see it in someone's actions, does it really matter? But the encyclopedia also dives into behaviorism as a strict scientific doctrine, and that's what we'll be unpacking today.
So how does this doctrine of behaviorism actually explain things?
Well, it starts with this idea. Psychology should be the science of behavior, not the science of some hidden mental world. That means focusing on explaining what people do, not just guessing at what they think.
I'm starting to see the connection to that observable actions idea you mentioned earlier. So does this mean behaviorists think our thoughts and feelings don't matter?
Not necessarily. It's more about saying that thoughts and feelings are, well, messy. If we want to build a solid scientific understanding of behavior, we need to start with something we can measure and study directly our actions.
That's interesting. So it's like, instead of trying to explain why someone is sad, a behaviorist would look at how they're acting, crying, withdrawing from social events, things like that.
Exactly. And then they'd try to connect those behaviors to things in the person's environment or their past experiences. Behaviorists believe those external factors are the real key to understanding why we do what we do.
Okay, I'm starting to get the logic here. But the Stanford Encyclopedia mentions 3 types of behaviorism: methodological, psychological, and analytical. How do those fit together?
Think of it this way. They're all focused on explaining behavior, but they each have a slightly different angle. Methodological behaviorism sets the ground rules for how we should study psychology. It says, stick to observable behavior. Don't get bogged down in speculation about the mind.
So methodological behaviorism is like the referee, making sure everyone plays by the rules.
Exactly. Then you have psychological behaviorism, which is all about doing research. This is where we get into things like stimuli, responses, and reinforcement.
Ooh, reinforcement. I remember that from my intro to psychology class. It's about how rewards and punishments shape our actions, right?
That's it. Psychological behaviorism tries to break down how we learn through experience. You've probably seen those videos of rats pressing levers for food pellets.
Right. Is that what psychological behaviorism is all about? Explaining how those associations form?
Exactly. It's about understanding how those connections between actions and outcomes drive our behavior, even in much more complex situations.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about analytical behaviorism? That one sounds a bit more philosophical.
It is. Analytical behaviorism is all about the meaning of mental terms. It says that words like belief or desire aren't about some mysterious inner state. They're actually just ways of talking about what people are likely to do in certain situations.
So instead of saying, she believes it's going to rain, an analytical behaviorist would say something like, she's carrying an umbrella.
Exactly. It's about grounding the mental concepts in observable actions. After all, if someone says they believe something, but their behavior doesn't reflect that belief, does it really mean anything?
That's a really interesting way to think about it. It makes belief less about what's going on in someone's head and more about how they're likely to act. So we've got these 3 different types of behaviorism. Are they all connected somehow?
They are. Each one builds on the core idea that behavior is the key for understanding, well, everything, but they come from different places in the history of ideas. For example, analytical behaviorism has roots in logical positivism, which was this big philosophical movement that said the meaning of a statement comes from how we can verify it through observation.
Right. It's all about tying those big ideas to what we can actually see and measure in the real world.
Exactly. And that's why analytical behaviorists are so focused on connecting mental terms like belief to observable actions. If we can't see it, it's not meaningful.
That makes sense. Now, what about psychological behaviorism? Where did that come from?
Psychological behaviorism draws on ideas that are even older. Classical associationism, which goes all the way back to philosophers like John Locke and David Hume.
Ah, those guys. They believed we learn by forming associations between experiences. Like, if you always hear a bell ring before dinner, you start to associate the bell with food.
Precisely. And psychological behaviorism takes this idea of association and applies it to explaining all sorts of behavior, but it strips away the focus on what's happening inside the mind and just looks at the connections between external stimuli and observable responses.
Okay, I see the link there. So it's like classical associationism, but with a more scientific, less philosophical approach.
Exactly. And then there's methodological behaviorism, which is really focused on the practicalities of scientific study. John B. Watson, one of the founders of behaviorism, was a big proponent of this approach.
Right, Watson. He was all about making psychology a hard science, like physics or chemistry. That meant focusing on what we can observe it and measure, not fuzzy concepts like thoughts or feelings.
Precisely. For Watson, talking about inner mental states was unscientific and a waste of time. He wanted to bring psychology into the realm of objective, measurable data.
Okay, so these different strains of behaviorism all come from slightly different places, but they share this common thread, the idea that behavior is the key to unlocking the mysteries of the mind, or at least what we can understand about the mind.
Exactly, and that's what makes behaviorism so fascinating and sometimes so controversial.
You said it. Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia mentions that all three types of behaviorism come together in one particular school of thought, B.F. Skinner's radical behaviorism.
Ah, yes, Skinner's the rock star of behaviorism. His ideas really took the movement to a whole new level.
All right, before we dive into Skinner, let's take a step back. Why would anyone even want to be a behaviorist? What's so appealing about this approach?
That's a great question. The Stanford Encyclopedia outlines three main reasons someone might find behaviorism compelling. The first is that it's all about evidence. The only real way to know what's happening in someone's mind is by looking at their behavior. Their actions are the data points, the evidence we have to work with.
Right, it's like trying to figure out what kind of music someone likes. You can ask them, but the real proof is in what they actually listen to.
Exactly, and that focus on observable evidence is a big part of what makes behaviorism appealing to many people. It feels grounded, concrete, scientific.
Okay, I get that. What about the other reasons? What else makes behaviorism stand out?
Well, the second reason is that behaviorism is strongly anti-nativist. This means it rejects the idea that we're born with pre-programmed behaviors or innate knowledge. Instead, behaviorists believe we learn everything through experience, through interacting with the world around us.
So taking a side in that classic nature versus nurture debate, behaviorists are firmly on the side of nurture.
Precisely. They believe our environment shapes who we are, and our behaviors are the products of our experiences, not some predetermined blueprint.
That's a pretty powerful idea. It means we have the potential to change and adapt based on what we encounter in life.
Exactly. Now, the third reason for behaviorism's appeal is its emphasis on avoiding circular explanations. Behaviorists are wary of trying to explain behavior using mental states that themselves need to be explained.
That makes sense. It's like saying he ran because he was afraid. But then you have to ask, well, why was he afraid? You just end up going in circles.
Exactly. Behaviorists want to cut to the chase and find the root cause of that fear in the person's environment or their past experiences.
So instead of just attributing everything to some mysterious feeling of fear, they'd look for the specific things that triggered that fear.
That's right. They want explanations that are grounded in observable events, not just abstract mental states.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all of this fits together. But how does this all play out in B.F. Skinner's work? He's the guy everyone thinks of when they hear the word behaviorism, right?
Absolutely. He's arguably the most famous and influential behaviorist, and his ideas really took the movement in new directions.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into the world of Skinner. What were some of his key insights?
Well, Skinner's radical behaviorism takes those core principles we talked about, evidence, nurture, avoiding circular explanations, and pushes them even further. He was obsessed with understanding behavior in terms of its relationship to the environment and an organism's learning history.
So it's all about how our experiences shape our actions.
Exactly. And this is where his famous idea of operant conditioning comes in. Skinner argued that behaviors are shaped by their consequences. If a behavior leads to a positive outcome, what he called reinforcement, then it becomes more likely to occur again in the future.
Okay, so it's like learning through trial and error. You try different things, and the actions that lead to rewards stick around?
That's the basic idea. But Skinner went way beyond simply observing these patterns. He meticulously studied how different schedules of reinforcement, like how often a reward is given, affected the strength and persistence of behaviors.
So he wasn't just saying reinforcement matters. He was figuring out the nitty-gritty details of how it works.
Exactly. And his research led to some truly groundbreaking insights into the mechanics of learning.
I've heard of Skinner's famous Skinner box experiments. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. The Skinner box is a classic example of how he studied operant conditioning. It's basically a controlled environment where researchers can precisely manipulate the consequences of an animal's actions and see how those consequences shape their behavior.
Okay, so it's like a laboratory for studying learning.
Precisely. And the insights Skinner gained from these experiments had a huge impact on our understanding of how behavior works.
Now, Skinner is also famous for his controversial social vision. The idea of designing a utopian society based on behaviorist principles.
Ah, yes, this is where we get into the world of Walden 2, Skinner's fictional utopia.
Walden 2. Okay, tell me more about that. What was Skinner's vision for this perfect society?
Well, the central idea was that we can create a better world by controlling the environment and using positive reinforcement to encourage what he considered to be desirable actions.
So instead of relying on laws and punishment, you design an environment where people are naturally inclined to do good things.
Exactly. Skinner believed that by carefully structuring society and using positive reinforcement to guide people's choices, you could create a world free from many of the problems we face today.
That's a bold idea. It sounds like something straight out of a science fiction novel.
It does. And in many ways, Walden 2 is a thought experiment, exploring what would happen if we took behaviorism to its logical extreme.
But I imagine this idea also sparked a lot of debate and criticism.
Of course. Many people argued that Skinner's utopia was overly simplistic and ignored the complexities of human nature.
What were some of the main concerns people had about Walden 2?
Well, one of the biggest criticisms was that Skinner's vision seemed to leave little room for individual freedom and autonomy. If our behavior is just a product of our environment, what happens to free will? Are we just puppets being controlled by whoever designs the environment?
That's a big question. A society designed around controlling behavior could end up feeling a bit oppressive, couldn't it?
Absolutely. That was a major concern for many people. They also pointed out that Skinner's descriptions of Walden 2 were often pretty vague, lacking the practical details of how such a society would actually function.
So it was a compelling vision in theory, but maybe a bit difficult to translate into reality.
Exactly. There was also the question of who gets to decide what desirable behavior even means. What happens if people disagree about the values that should guide society?
Right, because desirable is a subjective term. What one person sees as good or right might be totally different for someone else.
That's a crucial point. Walden 2 raised a lot of questions about power and control. Critics worried that those in power could manipulate the system to their advantage.
So while it was a fascinating thought experiment, it also highlighted some of the potential pitfalls of trying to engineer society based solely on behaviorist principles.
Exactly, and these questions about power and control apply to behaviorism more broadly. It's one thing to talk about shaping behavior through reinforcement, but who gets to decide what gets reinforced?
That's a great point. So Walden 2 was a bold vision, but it also forced people to confront some uncomfortable questions about the ethics of behaviorism and the potential for manipulation.
Absolutely. Now, despite its popularity for several decades, behaviorism eventually lost its grip on the field of psychology. It stopped being the dominant force it once was. Why do you think that happened?
Well, I'm guessing it has something to do with all the things we've been discussing. The limitations of focusing solely on observable behavior, the ethical concerns about control and manipulation.
You're on the right track. There were a number of factors that contributed to the decline of behaviorism.
So what were some of the main reasons behaviorism fell out of favor?
Well, one of the biggest challenges was that it struggled to explain those messy internal processes, the thoughts, feelings, and interpretations that influence our actions.
Like we were saying earlier, behaviorism wanted to focus on what we do, but sometimes what we think and feel matters too.
Right, exactly. Critics argued that we don't just react to stimuli in the environment, we interpret them based on our past experiences, our beliefs, our goals, and those internal processes have a huge impact on how we behave.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not enough to just look at the external factors. We have to consider what's going on inside the black box of the mind, too.
Right. And this is where cognitive psychology stepped in. Cognitive psychologists started exploring those internal mental processes, things like memory, attention, problem solving, and language that behaviorism had largely ignored.
Can you give me an example of how behaviorism might fall short in explaining something that cognitive psychology could address?
Sure. Imagine someone who's terrified of spiders. A behaviorist might say that this fear is simply a learned response to certain stimuli, like the sight of a spider.
So they've been conditioned to associate spiders with something negative, like danger or pain.
Right, but now imagine you show this person a very realistic toy spider. Even though it's not a real spider, they might still react with intense fear.
That's interesting. So their reaction isn't just about the external stimulus, it's also about how they're perceiving and interpreting that stimulus, based on their existing beliefs about spiders.
Exactly. Their internal mental representation of spiders as dangerous is shaping their response. Even when the actual stimulus is objectively harmless, Cognitive psychology would argue that we need to understand these mental representations to fully explain behavior.
So it's not just about the objective reality of the situation, it's about how our minds make sense of that reality.
Precisely. And that's a key insight that behaviorism, with its focus on external factors, struggled to incorporate.
Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia also mentions this idea of qualius, those subjective experiential qualities of our mental states, like the feeling of pain or the redness of red. How does that challenge behaviorism?
That's a great point. Qualia are kind of a thorn in the side of behaviorism because they can't be explained simply by observing someone's actions. You could imagine a robot that acts exactly like it's in pain. It cries out, withdraws from harmful stimuli, and so on, but doesn't actually feel anything.
It's like the philosophical zombie idea. It behaves just like us, but there's no conscious experience behind it.
Exactly. Qualia highlight the fact that there's more to our mental lives than just observable behavior. Our inner, subjective experiences are real, and they can't be reduced to simple stimulus response patterns.
That makes sense. So even if we could perfectly explain someone's actions in terms of their environment and learning history, we'd still be missing a crucial part of the picture, what it actually feels like to be that person.
Absolutely. And that's a limitation that many people saw in the behaviorist approach.
Now, perhaps the most famous challenge to behaviorism came from linguist Noam Chomsky, right? What was his critique all about?
Chomsky's critique was a real game changer. He argued that behaviorist models simply couldn't explain how children learn language so quickly and effortlessly.
It's true, kids seem to pick up language almost by magic. They're forming complex sentences and understanding grammatical rules way faster than you'd expect if they were just learning through reinforcement.
Exactly. Chomsky argued that we must have some innate capacity for language, a universal grammar hardwired into our brains. That allows us to acquire language so rapidly. It's not just about environmental input. We come pre-equipped with some linguistic abilities.
So we're not just blank slates being molded by our experiences. We have some internal structure that guides our language learning.
That's right. And that idea was a major challenge to behaviorism's emphasis on the environment as the primary driver of learning.
Chomsky's work really shook things up in the field. It showed that there were some aspects of human behavior that just couldn't be explained by behaviorist principles alone.
Absolutely. It helped pave the way for what we now call the cognitive revolution in psychology, a shift towards understanding the mind as an active information processor, not just a passive recipient of environmental input.
So with all these challenges, the inability to fully account for internal processes, qualia, the complexities of language acquisition, is it safe to say that behaviorism is dead?
Well, that's a complicated question. While behaviorism might not be the dominant force it once was, it hasn't completely disappeared.
Are there any areas where behaviorist ideas are still influential today?
Definitely. Behavior therapy, which is based on the principles of behaviorism, is still widely used to treat a variety of mental health conditions.
So even though behaviorism might not be the best model for explaining everything about the human mind, it can still be a useful tool for helping people change their behavior and improve their well-being.
Exactly. And there's also a lot of interest in how behaviorism can be integrated with other approaches, like neuroscience.
Really? I thought those were two totally separate fields.
They used to be seen that way. But there's growing interest in how brain mechanisms might actually underlie the principles of behaviorism. For example, researchers are studying how the brain's reward pathways are involved in reinforcement learning, those same processes that Skinner was so interested in.
So instead of just studying behavior at the level of actions and outcomes, we can now look inside the brain and see what's happening at a neural level.
That's right. And this kind of research could potentially help us understand how those environmental factors that behaviorists emphasized actually get translated into changes in the brain.
So it's not about pitting behaviorism against cognitive psychology or neuroscience. It's about finding ways to bring them together to create a more complete and nuanced understanding of human behavior.
Exactly. And that's what a lot of researchers are working on today. They're trying to bridge the gap between these different perspectives and find ways to integrate the best insights from each.
It sounds like behaviorism, even though it's not the dominant force it once was, still has a lot to offer.
It really does. It reminds us to pay attention to the power of the environment, to recognize the ways our experiences shape our actions. And even though it might not have all the answers, it still provides a valuable framework for thinking about how we learn and how we can change our behavior.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? We've explored the different types of behaviorism, its historical roots, its strengths and limitations, its controversial applications, and its enduring legacy.
We've seen how behaviorism tried to explain everything we do in terms of our environment and our learning history, and we've seen how that approach also ran into some serious challenges.
But even in its decline, behaviorism left behind a rich legacy of ideas and techniques that continue to influence how we understand and treat human behavior.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that the study of the mind is a constantly evolving journey, with new discoveries and new challenges always on the horizon.
Now, before we wrap up, we want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. If we can shape our behavior through things like reinforcement and conditioning, as behaviorism suggests, to what extent are we really in control of our own actions? It's a question that philosophers and scientists have been debating for centuries, and it's one that we invite you to consider as you continue your own deep dives into the mysteries of the human mind.
That's a great question to ponder, and it highlights the fact that even though behaviorism might have fallen out of favor as a grand theory of everything, it still raises profound questions about what it means to be human, about free will, and about the forces that shape who we are.
Until next time, keep exploring and keep questioning.